This video is a part of a series created in collaboration with the George C. Marshall International Center about George Catlett Marshall Jr. and his home, Dodona Manor. The George C. Marshall International Center brings to life the timeless values of selfless service and unwavering integrity to develop visionary leaders worldwide. Learn more about Dodona Manor, view upcoming events, and join the mission to preserve Marshall's legacy at georgecmarshall.org.
The Houb room, and then we just do the route as we normally go.
Yeah.
To it, okay?
Yeah, that's right. Worst case, I look bad.
Of course, one of the great things in here is, one of the extraordinary things Marshall did, of course, is the Marshall Plan. And that's what this exhibit is all about here, talking about the history of the Marshall Plan. From the time that he became Secretary of State in January of 1947. Of course, what he found was right back from China. Europe was in great disarray. People were starving to death. The winter before he became Secretary of State in January of 1947, for example, in Berlin, well, they're digging thousands of graves for the people they know are going to die of starvation during the winter. It's a really grim time. And then along came what we know today as the Marshall Plan. And that changed everything. People had food, they had hope of a better life, and that changed everything. And of course, one of the really difficult things, if you're going to rebuild the economies of your friends and allies after a war, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But if you're going to rebuild the economies of the folks you fought against, like the Germans and the Italians before they changed, that's a different thing entirely. And of course, this house almost didn't exist today as we know it, because in about 1989, a local individual named B. Powell Harrison learned that some developers were about to buy this house to turn it into a shopping center. And of course, he started a foundation to try to raise the money to save this house as a legacy to Marshall. Of course, B. Powell was a lifelong Leesburg resident, a graduate of Virginia Military Institute, same place Marshall attended school, Army officer in World War II. And of course, when he learned that this house was about to be bought to become a shopping center, he started a foundation to try to raise money to save this house. And of course, it's not an easy task in the 1990 time frame to raise money, because we had the savings and loan debacle in this country, and the country went into recession in 1990. He just stayed after it. Well, it took him 6 years to raise the $2.3 million needed just to buy this property, take possession from the family. And of course, it took him several more years to raise the additional $5 million plus needed to do the restoration and the renovation of this house. It was a 16-year effort, and then this house was opened to the public on Veterans Day in 2005. So we talk about the Houbs. We call it the Houb room. Well, I just call your attention to this little plaque here. Houb exhibit room, dedicated in honor of Helga and Irvin Houb, and talking about their generous support, May 18, 2015. Well, who were the Houbs? Well, they were a German couple. They gave $1.5 million to help procure and buy this property to save it as a legacy to Marshall. Well, think about that. A German couple, out of their gratitude of what we know today as the Marshall Plan, helping rebuild their economy after World War II. So the Marshall Plan is a big deal for millions and millions of Europeans. And
What exactly, just briefly summarize, what was the Marshall Plan?
The Marshall Plan was an effort to rebuild the economies of war-torn Europe after World War II. And of course, we think about a Marshall Plan or foreign aid typically as, here's some money, go do with it as you think. Well, this was not a, we're going to give you the money, you do what you want to do. It was a different concept. And It was to, you have skin in the game, you decide the priorities for the rebuilding and so forth, and you've got to cooperate. That's one of the things. You got to trade with each other. There were several really components, but one little simple, let's say, example of the Marshall Plan. Let's suppose after the war, a farmer in France wants to buy a tractor so he can become more productive.
Yeah.
And so that gets approved. He gets a tractor. U.S. produces that tractor. Maybe it's a John Deere. U.S. government pays John Deere for the tractor. Oh, the French farmer doesn't get the tractor free. He's got to pay for it.
Yeah.
He's got to pay the French government. And of course, they've been all broke too. So, they get recapitalized. And of course, it was kind of a good circle. But out of that, the French farmer pays for the tractor. He becomes more productive and more efficient. And so everybody wins. But through that and many other examples, they recovered, become a little more self-sufficient, and recovered from the war. It was a big deal. One of the things, as I said, it was not really popular that we're going to help rebuild the economies of our enemies.
Yeah.
But Marshall knew if you're going to have peace in Europe, well, by the way, he was in 2 world wars in Europe in just a few decades. If you're going to have peace, everybody's got to eat. Everybody's got to have hope of a better life. And so that's what it was all about. And of course, Marshall would never want it to be named in his honor. He would say, it was a team effort. I'm just one of the people. But it's a remarkable story, and of course, that all had to do with legislation to be created and approved.
Yeah.
And so he went out across the country after his speech, where he laid out the basic concept at Harvard in June of 1947, and trying to convince the American people this is the right thing to do. Of course, he talked to the garden clubs, Rotary clubs, cotton farmers, who would listen, and played a key role in convincing the American people this is the right thing to do. And of course, that's been proven in history over the last 75 years plus.
So what was the most significant thing that Marshall did that, like, above all else, what kind of person was he?
He was a man of character. He was a Christian gentleman. He judged others by their character. He said the most important thing is a person's character. And that's what he used. He had several things he used when he picked the major commanders. First was character. Who vouches for this guy? That told him a lot about the person. Professional development, professional education. You want to make sure they've gone to the schools, they understand the lingo, and they understand the basic concept. Understanding the modern techniques and the common languages and the concepts and all that was really important. And but the number one thing was character.
How would you define character?
Well, character is a combination of things, in my view. It's a person's integrity. It's also their fortitude, their willingness and ability to stand up and be counted when things are really tough. To do what might not be popular, for example, in several encounters in his life, when it was not the popular thing to do, he would stand up and express his opinion. Always doing that politely and without being nasty about it.
Yeah.
But he was a man of candor, speak your mind, integrity, always do the right thing, and a selfless servant, always doing what's best for everyone, for the group, for the country.
And how did he reflect his character into his house?
Well, I see it when I think about the things that he did in this house, things that are represented in this house, throughout his lifetime with both of his wives. And that can be represented by the paintings you see, and some of the books you'll see in the library, and all kinds of furniture in the house.
What was this room when he was this like more of like just a common room or a multi-purpose room?
This was a multi-purpose room, and it was a nursery for the grandchildren in some points of time. For example, in 1943, Normandy, D-Day invasion of Europe is on the horizon. And, that decision had been made as who's going to be the commander. Yeah. And a lot of people thought it should be Marshall. He deserved it. And of course, that was a tough decision for the president, President Roosevelt. So in the winter of 1943, daughter Molly brings the grandkids up to stay with mother, Katherine, at Fort Myer because they think George may be going away to command Operation Overlord. And of course, Katherine will be by herself, and of course, decisions yet to be made. So President Roosevelt asked Marshall to come in and talk to him about that. And of course he did, and when he appeared, the president said, well, it's time to name the commander. Should it be you? Yeah. And of course, that's when Marshall said, well, Mr. President, that's your decision. But my personal desires have no place in this decision. And of course, a lot of the people are writing President Roosevelt and saying, it can't be Marshall. You can't do without him here in the country. He's got the confidence of yourself and also the confidence of both sides of the aisle in Congress. And so...
confidence as in trust, right?
Well, trust. Here's somebody who does what he says he's going to do. Of course, Marshall had taken that army, U.S. Army, air and ground, of about 175,000 soldiers when the war started. And he'd built that into a force of 8 million right now. Quite a feat when you understand what the Chief of Staff of the Army is responsible for. And so Marshall said, well, Mr. President, my personal desires have no place in this decision. And that's when Mr. Roosevelt said, well, I don't think I could sleep at night with you out of the country. So that decision was been made. But in the meantime, Katherine brought the kids out here. If George is going away, we're not staying at Fort Myer. We're coming out to Leesburg. So this was a nursery for the grandkids during that winter of 1943. We'll go over to the guest bedroom.
So the guest room has always been kind of weird just because it's the biggest room, the biggest bedroom.
Well, most people in here will say, geez, nicest room in the house. Why didn't they sleep in here? And it is a nice big room, and it's, kind of ideal to be a guest bedroom. You got a place to sleep, you got a place to sit and read, you got a place to write, you got a place to primp, you got your own bathroom. So it's kind of ideal for that. And oh, by the way, the Marshall's bedroom's on the other end of the house, so everybody's got a little space when you have guests here. So yes, had a lot of famous visitors here. This lady's picture right here on the dresser spent more than one occasion here, and that's Madame Chiang Kai-shek of China, of course. When she would come and visit, she would bring 4 maids with her. 3 would be sleeping over in the room we were just in, the Houb room, and 1 would be sleeping at the foot of the bed here to be on call during the evening if needed. So, had a lot of famous visitors here. Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Sir John Dill spent the night here. I think Bernard Baruch and his wife, folks of that stature, would be friends and guests of the Marshalls.
Yeah. Is there anything like really cool about this room that makes it like have its own personality?
Well, I like this room because one of the additions after the 1850s here was the bay windows on both levels. You can see where the floor changes here in the house. And that's a popular architectural feature. You have more lighting and more seating. Also, one of the great things about this room is you got your own bathroom here, right off the room. And of course, you can see in this house, when you add pipes and put indoor plumbing in, you have to find room for the pipes. So you'll see the raised floor there for the bathroom, which, is not uncommon in these houses that have been improved over time.
Is there anything else about this room that's like pretty cool to mention?
I would say one thing. We've taken great care here to get things back just the way they were when the Marshalls lived here. When I began docenting here several years ago, this was painted a solid color in this room.
Kind of like the bathroom being one color?
Yeah, it was a solid color. But we had drawings from the grandkids on what the wallpaper looked like as they remembered it as young children, either living here or visiting here. And so research was done on all the old wallpaper patterns that existed in this country in the 1940s. And we think that we have it back to the original patterns that the Marshalls enjoyed when they lived here. And oh, by the way, about 90% of the furnishings you see in this house are original to the Marshalls when they lived here, which is rather unique for these type of house museums from that period in history.
Right. So how much did it cost to reproduce all the wallpaper?
Well, I couldn't give you a figure for the wallpaper. This is reproduction, authentic reproduction of that original pattern, which I'm sure they had to procure and probably had to run some new production rolls of it. As you come out of the Houb room here, watch your step. Might be a good place to talk about the history of the house a little bit. I don't know if anything looks unusual to you out here, but look at this window, for example. The two windows. Oh, those are exterior window casings. So let me give you a little bit about the history of the house. About 1806, a local builder named John Dresch bought this property. And between 1826 and 29, he built the federal block that we just been in, the 2 rooms up, 2 rooms down. And he built it right next to this pre-existing 2-story structure that's right here in front of us. And of course, we're standing on the second level of this original 2-story house that was built sometime before the early 1800s. We're not sure. Then over time, they built this brick front here to align with the federal block. That gave them room to add a stairway and going up and add a 3rd story on this side of the house. So 3 stories over here at one ceiling height, 2 stories over here at another ceiling height. Hence, we had to come down the steps to stay aligned here on this second level. This was all done by the early 1850s. Need a lot of room then. This was a girls' finishing school in the 1850s. And then it became a private residence again over time. And in 1935, a family named the Elys bought this property. Mr. Ely happened to be a member of Mr. Hoover's administration. And while they owned it, they've been in modern plumbing, electricity, running water, and all that. And after about 5 years of this Washington scene, they're ready to go back home, so they put it on the market. Katherine saw the for sale sign. And so when they bought it, they got an upgraded house with indoor plumbing and electricity and all the modern things of the day. And they really only made 2 major changes to the house. One of those was the front porch, which was wooden when they first moved in. It is now brick, and the front steps are now brick. And then the stone court on the southeast side, which Katherine had built in 1942. So when they bought it as a getaway place during the war years, they really got a modernized place with all the modern conveniences of the time. Okay, let's move into Katherine's bedroom. See some of the ladies' touches in here. She was a smoker. You're going to see evidence of that, of course. quite a young lady herself. Born in Kentucky, daughter of a Baptist minister. Really attractive. And so let's talk about Marshall had 2 wives in his lifetime. His first wife, Lily, he met while he was a student at Virginia Military Institute. She was a beautiful young lady, a great personality, had a heart condition, could never have children. They were happily married for 25 years. She died very suddenly. And then he was a widower for a couple of years. And then he met and married his second wife, Katherine. So it was with Katherine that he lived here at this house in Leesburg. She was a widow. She had 3 children with her first husband. He never had any children of his own with either wife, but 3 stepchildren with that marriage to Katherine. Very attractive young lady, daughter of a Baptist minister from the state of Kentucky. Went to Hollins College in Roanoke. There, for example, there's a little cover of a magazine from Hollins with George and Katherine on the cover. Graduated from Hollins, went to New York City, studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts for a couple of years. Wanted to be an actress. Unfortunately, it was not a very reputable profession back in the early 1900s, particularly if you're a daughter of a Baptist minister from Kentucky. But as luck would have it, her older sister, Eileen, had gone to London to live for a while. So she asked her father if she could go to London and spend time with her sister, and he finally agreed, provided don't get in that acting business. Well, she went to the UK, joined the Shakespeare and Traveling Company, traveling around UK, giving Shakespeare performances. Leading lady, here she is in Romeo and Juliet, another Shakespeare production, having the time of her life, and really became an actress. But then her health began to fail her in the UK, so she gave up her acting career, came back to the U.S., Baltimore, to regain her health. She did, tried her hand at acting again, but found that her health wouldn't permit it, so she gave up that acting career. And then she married a prominent Baltimore attorney, and she had 3 children. Yeah. Quite a lady. 1953, President Eisenhower asked Marshall if he would head up the U.S. delegation to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. And of course he did. And of course Katherine is not a wealthy lady. None of the Marshalls have any wealth. And of course she went to the UK for that coronation. Here's the gown she bought off the shelf at Pinehurst, North Carolina, to wear to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. Quite a lady. No designer gowns for Katherine, but something appropriate and affordable. But she would always be neatly dressed. Here she is. Quite a lady in her own right. Wrote her own book in 1946, talking about their meeting and their life together during the war and so forth. She thought his public career was over when he retired from the Army in late 1945. Little did they know what was to unfold the next few years. They did have separate bedrooms. Not unusual for the time, but we know they had different lifestyles, particularly in the morning. He's a military guy. He's up, he's going, up early. She liked to sleep in, have breakfast in bed a lot. You'll see evidence of that. So they had 2 different lifestyles, particularly during the morning hours. So George's bathroom is right on down the hallway with a connecting bath in between the 2 bedrooms. And again, some of her furnishings, her clothes are in the closet here. Her hats, her shoes, gloves, glove hangers, and some of those kind of items. She was an extraordinary lady in her own right. You mentioned earlier about places to write in the house. Well, here's a good example. And you see the stationery. And one of the things you'll notice when you look at the telephone downstairs, it's 1301. But you'll see on the stationery, when the Marshalls were here originally at their time, it was Leesburg 4, because Leesburg was a little smaller when they first bought this place. And of course, oh, by the way, Marshall did head up that coronation of Queen Elizabeth, and as he was processing into Westminster, as he entered, and General Omar Bradley was part of that U.S. delegation, was on his side processing in, Marshall noticed that everyone stood. And he looked around to say, oh, somebody important must have come in. And, of course, General Bradley said, no, General, they were standing for you. Because at that time in his life, Marshall was one of the most popular individuals in the world because of World War II, the leadership throughout the war. Then as Secretary of State, the Marshall Plan had been developed and was being implemented, had been implemented for a few years by then. So rather extraordinary stature in the world at that point in time.
It's a simple, how come there's not wallpaper like there was in the other room?
I couldn't tell you. Each room has its own personality. But great pains were made here. I talked about, the house almost being... So it fell into great disrepair. And when it was restored, great pains were taken to ensure that everything was put back here, colors, wallpaper, items in the specific places where they now are sitting, just as the way the Marshalls had it when they lived here. But I can't give you a reason for Katherine's decorative taste in each room. Of course, Marshall appeared on the covers of many of the magazines of the day. He was Time Man of the Year twice. Here he is on the cover of My Life magazine in December of 1950 during the Korean War.
So I've always wondered, what is that vent?
I think that's probably part of the old heating system that existed here in the house at the time. You see a lot of fireplaces. I know they had a furnace. One of the great things that was done when this house was renovated, when it was to be saved, was they installed a geothermal heating and cooling system under the house to try to keep it a kind of a constant temperature year-round. Of course, for a period of time, he was a trustee of the National Geographic Society. So you see some of the old National Geographic publications. Of course, lots of us have many of those in our basements and boxes. They're great publications. Come into George's bedroom. Get a little different look in here. Some historian says this is kind of a millinery, no-nonsense, decorative style, which pretty well sums it up. A couple of little artifacts, an old pistol holder, a map case, white mesh dinner jacket. Of course, one of Marshall's great stress relievers was horseback riding. And so you'll see his old boot jack here, which he would use to help pull his boots off. And these carpets are pretty neat. This is a 3-carpet set. You'll see the Chinese characters, we think probably made especially for him in China. We don't know if it's something he purchased or it was a gift. But if you read those Chinese characters, the first one being a horse, pronounced Ma, and the next one being for a soldier, and the third one for a person of high position, it kind of comes out in Chinese like Marshal Lu, approximating Marshall in Chinese. So Marshall was a very modest man of simple taste. Here in the closet, for example, You'll see some of his clothing and accessories. There's his hat box with his initials up there. He liked to play tennis, so you'll see his old tennis racket up on the top shelf. We talked about his horseback riding. There's his riding boots up on the second shelf. Here's his robe. Of course, we have photographs here of wearing that robe with some Oriental features on it. And of course, every gentleman in those days had to have some white shoes to spruce up on a hot August Sunday afternoon. A modest man of simple taste. One of the perks after he became a permanent five-star general in 1946 was he had an orderly, an Army sergeant who lived here. It would help drive him around and help with those kinds of things. He said that this old nightstand used to be painted white, but he finally convinced the general to let him strip it off and paint it a darker color to blend in with his other furnishings. So, modest man of simple taste, and Marshall didn't live on pretensions. We know of 3 Americans that Marshall admired an awful lot, and here's a picture of one of them, George Washington, of course. And we're going to see another one when we go to the library. And that third one was Benjamin Franklin. Why? Why did he admire Franklin? Common sense. Understanding of human nature, things that were really important to Marshall.
And the second one was Robert E. Lee.
We'll see his picture down there, Robert E. Lee, yeah. There's no Audubon print. Those wildlife prints were very popular back in that era. Well, if you look at this window, you see it's kind of a replay of what we saw upstairs, except we're standing on the front porch of this original 2-story structure. Here's the old telephone, 1301. Now we know when the Marshalls first moved in, it was number 4. Leesburg was a small town, not many telephones during that era. I'd like to talk about a really important part of Marshall's life here for a couple of minutes. So in 1924, he was assigned to China. His first wife, Lily, went with him. They were there for 3 years. Of course, the U.S. Army still had an infantry regiment stationed in China, holdover from the Boxer Rebellion. He's the number 2 guy in the regiment, 2I Seer of the executive officer. He's reassigned to Washington, and Lily's not been feeling well the last few weeks in China. She goes into Walter Reed Hospital to have some minor surgery, like a goiter removed from her thyroid. Successful operation. She's getting ready to come home the next day, writing a letter to her mother, and falls over dead, just like that. Yeah. Well, no warning.
Yeah.
Lily's gone. Marshall's devastated. He fell in great disrepair, very despondent. Asked for a transfer. Oh, sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, home of the infantry school. Head of academic instruction. He gets there, he looks around, and says, you know, the Great War has been over for a decade now. World War I, as we know it.
The war to end all wars.
Right. You're still teaching trench warfare down here. We get involved in another war, it's not going to be trench warfare. It's going to be a war of maneuver, movement, tanks, armored vehicles, heavy equipment. We got to get ready for that kind of war. Redoes the teaching methods, the curriculum, the whole program of instruction at Fort Benning, just throws himself into his work. But I think a very lonely man at that point in his life. In the meantime, Katherine has been married to this prominent Baltimore attorney. And her husband wins a case for the client, but then her husband has a dispute with the client over payment for his services, a billing matter. Well, long story short, client shoots her husband dead, so she's a widow with 3 teenage children. And she remains a widow for a year plus, and then she finds herself in California ready to travel cross country back to Baltimore. Her daughter Molly is traveling with her. And she decides she wants to swing through Columbus, Georgia, and pay a visit to the family of her old college roommate. And she does. And while she's in Columbus, she gets invited to a dinner party, and so does Marshall. And they appear in the home of the host, and the host asks if they'd like to have a cocktail before dinner. Marshall declines, and Katherine says something like, "Well, you must be a very unusual Army officer. Never known one to decline a cocktail before." And she said he had these eyes that could look right through you. And so he said, "Well, how many Army officers do you know?" And of course, she confessed, not many. But they had a nice little dinner party, and daughter Molly was there with her escort. And after dinner, Molly and escort want to run off and see Columbus. And George asked Katherine if he could drive her back to the home in Columbus where she's staying with a friend. She agrees. And so they just drive around Columbus. It's a small town, chit-chatting, getting acquainted for a while. After about an hour of that, Katherine said something like, "Well, Lieutenant Colonel Marshall, I'm really surprised. You having been assigned here at Fort Benning for a couple of years now, don't seem to know your way around Columbus, Georgia." And of course, he said, "Oh, I know my way around very well. That's how I managed to avoid your block for the last hour."
Yeah.
Well, they were married the following spring, so now he's got 3 stepchildren, Molly 18, Clifton 17, and Alan 14. This was Alan, of course. Alan lost his father very unexpectedly at an early age, and George was very sympathetic to that. So before he married Katherine, he wrote Alan a letter asking his permission to marry his mother. And of course, he responded, "Love to have you in the family. A friend in need is a friend indeed." They were very close. And of course, as the years go by, Alan grows up. He goes off to university, graduates. He's in New York working on his civilian career. And of course, the war comes along. And he looks around one day and says, "My father's an Army officer. My older brother Clifton is an Army officer. My sister Molly is married to an Army officer. It's time to do my part." So he goes to Officer Candidate School, trying to become a second lieutenant in the Armored Corps, if you see the patch on the sleeve. Succeeds, commissioned a second lieutenant, assigned to a unit. His unit is sent to the front, North Africa. He survives North Africa. His unit moves to Italy. He survives the Battle of Monte Cassino. And he's a platoon leader standing up in his armored vehicle advancing towards Rome. And a sniper, 1 round through the head, killed him instantly on May the 29th, 1944. Think about that date for just a minute. Now, the Normandy invasion, D-Day, is on the horizon 6 June 1944, 1 week before that. And of course, Marshall is kind of the mastermind for Normandy. He's convinced our allies, everyone, we got to do this. We got to take the fight to the Germans. We got to invade Europe. And of course, no one knows if the Normandy invasion is going to be a success or a disaster. He's got the weight of the world on his shoulders and loses a son right in that time frame. And of course, he's buried in the American cemetery in Anzio in Italy and left a wife and a small son, Tupper. But that's Alan. A couple of weeks after that Normandy invasion, he has a chance to go down to Italy, visit the troops there, visit Alan's gravesite, found out what happened to his son during his last days there. That's when this picture was taken. You'll see General Mark Clark in the back seat. He's the commander of the Italian theater at that point in time. And there's Marshall, of course, sitting in the front. Some friends of Marshall's, Queen Frederica of Greece, they became close friends. Of course, after World War II, the communists tried really hard to take over Greece. Marshall's Secretary of State from 47 to 49. Queen Frederica said Marshall was one of the primary people that helped avert the communists take over a country. So they became good friends. President Truman, of course, he worked very closely with, especially after the death of Mr. Roosevelt and the many years thereafter. course, he played on the football team at VMI, and you'll see him here in this football team's picture. His mother, Laura, who was very close with. Here again is one of the three Americans that we know he admired an awful lot, George Washington, and a print of VMI. Come into Marshall's favorite room. Actually, my favorite room. When I come in here, I have a special feeling. Daughter Margaret Truman, who was with her father when he was president here, wrote in her book that some of her favorite memories of being in Washington with her father is coming here, having lunch with the Marshalls. And of course, after lunch, if they didn't go to the lawn to talk, they would come here and talk about the pressing issues of the day. So if these walls could talk to us, they could tell us a lot of important things. Of course, we talked about the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, where he headed up the U.S. delegation. There's a replica of his Nobel Peace Prize. Lord Mountbatten, of course, British naval officer, was one of the senior commanders out in the Far East and Singapore area during World War II. A little Chinese wedding procession, other little knickknacks picked up here and there. You will see a collection of books, many of them autobiographies or biographies of famous people. History was Marshall's favorite subject, and so one of the ways he learned history was reading about the people that played those prominent roles in major events. Here's one of the three Americans that we know that Marshall admired a lot. Robert E. Lee, because of his character and because of his military skills. That is traditional picture that we see of Lee. Here is the young Lee. We don't see as often. So George was not a good student in grade school and high school, but his older brother Stuart went to VMI, became a chemist. He was an excellent student. And one day when George is trying to convince his parents to send him to VMI, he overhears his brother telling their mother, "Don't let George go to VMI. He'll disgrace the family name." He said, "Oh, I decided right then I'm going to wipe his eye. I'm going to show him a thing or two." He went to VMI. He applied himself. Not the top academic student, of course. He's middle of the class, but rose to the top of the Corps Cadets. He had the leadership skills. I think of Marshall as the lifelong learner. Here's an individual who takes what he learns in school together with his intelligence, his experience, figured out how to overcome and solve the challenges that he faced in his lifetime. He was a master at that. Yeah, so he's Secretary of State from 1947 to 49. What in the world do you do after you're Secretary of State? Well, the American Red Cross had fallen on hard times after the war, so the president asked Marshall, "We go be president of the Red Cross, restore that organization." And of course, he's doing that. He's traveling all over the country, trying to bring the local chapters in harmony with the national chapter. And then, summer of 1950, what happens? Oh, war breaks out in Korea. Of course, when that happens, all the diplomats out of Washington run out to Leesburg to talk to Marshall. What do we do? How do we handle this? What do you think? And of course, they go back and tell President Truman, "You got to talk to Marshall." Of course, Marshall had an appointment in the White House on the 5th of July, 1950, to talk to President Truman. But President Truman got up on the 4th of July that year and said, "I can't wait till tomorrow." He calls up Marshall, invites himself out to lunch with daughter Margaret, because he really wants to talk to Marshall and to physically see Marshall to see if he thinks he'll be physically capable of coming back and being Secretary of Defense and leading us through this war. And of course, he does ask Marshall to do that. So Marshall agreed to be Secretary of Defense for 1 year. So from September 1950 to September 1951, during the Korean War, he was Secretary of Defense. And then he finally retired from public life, and then he could sit in his easy chair. And on this 1953 General Electric radio-television combination with at least a 7-inch screen, he could listen to his favorite baseball team, the Brooklyn Dodgers in those days, or watch his favorite television program on at least a 7-inch screen, I'd say, like I Love Lucy, Gunsmoke, American Bandstand, some of the old programs of the day. If you were in here on a fall afternoon in 1955, well, you might have heard something about like this.
Now he looks into Roy Capanella. Nobody out, 2 out. The Dodgers leading 2-0. It's the last half of the 9th inning. Jerry Fonderson, who was wide up in the 2-2 pitch, a lot of ground ball on the left side. Huey restarts the throw first, and he's out. And the Dodgers win by a score of 2-0.
Marshall would never write his autobiography. He said once if he ever did, he'd have to tell the truth. Some people wouldn't like that, so he just refrained from that. But as he grew older, his friends were really getting worried. All of this is going to be lost to history. What are we going to do about that? They asked Dr. Farcy Pogue if he would interview Marshall and try to preserve some of this knowledge that he's carrying around. And I don't know what you know about Dr. Pogue, but Dr. Pogue was well-noted and great combat historian. He was a history professor at Murray State down in western Kentucky when he got drafted during the war and asked to join the Army historical team that was going to follow Eisenhower and his forces across Europe after the invasion of Normandy. And of course, Dr. Pogue started interviewing casualties of that war on 6 June, and then he went ashore himself within the next 48 hours. And, of course, he was a great combat historian during World War II. In fact, President Eisenhower asked him to write his Supreme Command report on the war in Europe, which he was primary author of that. And then, of course, when asked to try to preserve some of this knowledge that Marshall's had, he jumped at the chance. He learned that Marshall had got a tape recorder the previous year, so he asked Marshall if he couldn't write him out some questions, give them to him in advance, let him think about them, and then come in and tape record those responses as he felt up to it. And, of course, Marshall thought about that, and he did agree, finally, with one proviso, that neither he nor any member of his family ever benefited financially from that effort. So with that agreement in hand, they started those interviews right here in this room, 1956. And then that winter down in Pinehurst. And then as Marshall felt up to it after that. But honestly, in his last years, Marshall was a very sick man and spent a lot of that time in the hospital. And so, thank goodness for those transcripts from those interviews, which are in a publication, Interviews and Reminiscences for Dr. Farcy Pogue. And of course, that was a good amount of Pogue's research for the 4-volume series he wrote on Marshall's life. Of course, it took him many years to do that. But thanks to Dr. Pogue, we know a lot about Marshall that we might not know otherwise. And so this room played a key role in those transcripts and all of that. Again, Marshall's favorite room. Let's move into Marshall's fancy office here. It's a modest little room. Of course, in his official capacity, Marshall always had an office either in the War Department, the Pentagon, State Department, Red Cross, wherever his duties were. This served really 2 purposes. It was also a powder room for Katherine. She could freshen up on this level without going upstairs. Here's where he'd write family members. He'd write Burpee Seed Company, order his plantings for his garden. He and David Burpee became good friends. The Burpreys were major contributors to restoring the grounds here at Dodona. Here's where he prepared for his mission to China in late 1945. Here's some artifacts, photographs of some of the conferences. Here he is with President Roosevelt, Mr. Churchill, other wartime leaders. Bernard Baruch, we can say a little bit more about him later. Here's an interesting little print by an amateur painter. His name is autographed here. I'll just mention that. Dwight D. Eisenhower. That's a place called Mount Eisenhower up in Canada. I think it's since been renamed. But here's Ike's little note to Mrs. Marshall. That was a gift, the print, 1959, after the death of George. Some people think Marshall built this little bookcase. We don't know that for sure. But again, didn't take a lot for Marshall to operate. Here's his old typewriter and his desk and his easy chair. Again, he liked hats, so he installed these sections of broomstick to keep his hats ready to go. Again, a modest man of simple taste. Well, this is the formal dining room. Of course, they didn't eat all their meals here. They reserved this for guests. And when they did entertain here, they would do it formally with wait staff. Here's a magazine of what a dinner party might look like. This photograph was probably staged for a magazine of the day. But you will see the little table here between the windows, just as it is today. This is their original Duncan Fife reproduction furniture that they moved in with. Carpet, chandelier. Katherine always had an eye for bargains. Here's a Duncan Fife piece that she bought in Washington at a house sale for $40 to blend in with other Duncan Fife pieces. The divider here by the doorway was an acquisition by Lily and George when they were in China from 1924 to 27. Of course, during a formal dinner party, it would be across the doorway to hide all the goings-on from the kitchen and the back rooms. These portraits are really nice. These were done by the J. Anthony Wills, who did the White House portraits for President Eisenhower and Nixon. These were done of both Katherine and George in the early 1950s. Really nice portraits of this couple. The gown she's wearing was probably a gift from Madame Chiang Kai-shek. One of the little pieces I'll just point out here is this silver service, a gift from the government of Brazil. And of course, during 1939, just a few months before he became Chief of Staff of the Army, he paid a goodwill visit to Brazil. He was acting Deputy Chief of Staff at Headquarters Department of the Army at the time. And of course, if we get involved in that war against Germany, we'd like to have Brazil on their side instead of the German side. So he's traveling around Brazil. One of those stops, they have a parade for him. And one of the things that catches his eye is these young boys in uniform with some farm implements. So he asked, who are those young boys? Well, they're orphans. And so he asked to speak to the ladies who ran the orphanage just to get their story. And of course, what he found is there are about 200 of these young boys. And he was so impressed with what these ladies had done with these young orphan boys that before he came back to the U.S., he and an aide go out and purchase candy to make a little gift packet for these 200 orphan boys. So a lot of people think about Marshall as this, high figure, very cold, very aloof. He was anything but. He was a really warm-hearted individual, always looking out for the little guy for the disadvantaged. That was Marshall. Well, here we are in the breakfast room. And of course, they didn't eat all their meals in the dining room. If they didn't have guests in the house, this is actually where they had their meals. Or if the weather's nice, they might just fix their plates here and move out to the stone court. Of course, Katherine had this built in 1942. This is really one of their favorite places out here. And, you could have breakfast out here. You could have lunch here. You could have friends over in the afternoon. There's the old wrought iron glass top table that the Marshalls enjoyed during their lifetime, which we still use for events here. They're early American or colonial tables and chairs. This is the wine bottle pattern that Katherine picked out when they first moved in. You'll notice this is a little lighter. This is reproduction of this same pattern. Here's some of the original, which we're able to salvage during the renovation. You see it's a little darker and so forth. Oh, she really liked the wine bottle pattern a lot better than the old rooster pattern that the Ely's had, the previous tenants. And when they renovated, they just left some of these old patterns in place here. Back in those days when you redecorated a room, you just put a fresh pattern over the old one, and you get too many, you take them off and you start all over again. Of course, this Chinese chest and jewelry chest were acquisitions by Lily and George when they were in China from 1924 to 1927. When I come in the kitchen in here, I say this could be my mother's kitchen, my grandmother's kitchen. This is kind of a typical kitchen from, I'd say, the 1950s. The original table and stools. A fairly new refrigerator, but of the old style. And of course, they even had a dishwasher. I think it was 1951 when Marshall bought the first sink dishwasher combination from Sears Roebuck. And this is a newer one, but of that old style. And of course, here are some of the implements of the day, an old ricer and an ice crusher, which were, pretty important implements of the day. One of the things that always catches my eye in here is these aluminum canisters and aluminum trays and things, metal things. Of course, we know that during World War II, metal was actually unavailable for household use because everything is going to the war effort. But then after the war, when the economy switched back to domestic needs, all these metal things proliferated during the late 1940s. This used to be an open fireplace, but was bricked off to make room for this newfangled push-button control range. And of course, a couple of cookbooks. They had help here, help with cooking. Katherine was kind of in the menu planning part of the operation, not the actual cooking. And of course, as you know, things were rationed throughout World War II. One of the things you may have noticed as we went through the house are little buzzers on the door frames. Above the door frame here is a typical, probably high-tech communication system for the day. Of course, this was a girls' finishing school in the 1850s. And they had wait staff here after it became a private home again. Don't ask me how they all work, but they had to have ways to communicate with folks on the second and third levels, or the second level over in the federal block. Let's move on this way. Chief of Staff of the Army is a 4-year tour. But Marshall didn't serve for 4 years. He served for 6 years plus throughout the war. From that first day of September 1939, when Germany attacked Poland, until the war's all over. So, and he had only a handful of days off in that period. Position of great responsibility. We didn't have an Air Force back then. He's got the air and the ground. So he finally gets retired. They're going to settle down and enjoy life. They have a big retirement ceremony for him. President Truman speaks. And the next day, all the boxes are being delivered from Fort Myer, and excitement in the air here. Katherine's here opening boxes. Daughter Molly's helping her placing things where they're going to be. They're finally going to settle down and enjoy life. And of course, the telephone rings, and it's for Marshall. Well, it's President Truman on the line, and he asked Marshall, now that you're not in the Army anymore, I need a little favor from you. Well, what's that, Mr. President? Oh, I need you to go to China. I need you to avoid a civil war there, bring the communists under Mao, the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek together, form a coalition government, everybody be happy. And when you need me, right away. And how can you say no to the president? So he agrees. Tells daughter Molly, says, don't tell your mother. She's going to be very upset. I want to let her get a good night's sleep. I'll tell her tomorrow. And of course, she hears it on the radio that evening before he ever has a chance to tell her. Well, he spends the next year in China. Katherine joins him there. And of course, two sides negotiate, and he's trying to facilitate that. They have their press conference. They announce what they're going to do. But neither side ever keeps their end of the bargain. They're both corrupt. So he comes back at the end of 1946, that mission a failure, and then becomes Secretary of State in January of 1947. While he's in China, this painting called Fish is a gift from the Chinese Cultural Enterprise Company, and then shipped to him as he left China at the end of 1946. That's a koi fish, supposedly a symbol of good luck. And that's also a lucky number of 9. So that might be one artifact that's reminiscent of that tour in China during 1946. One of we mentioned Bernard Baruch. We saw his photo back in the office. Those lithographs up the stairway, St. Albans steeplechase, are a gift from Bernard Baruch to Marshall. Of course, he's a horseback rider, Marshall, so those are probably an appropriate gift. Bernard Baruch was an advisor to multiple presidents. He headed up what I call the War Resources Board during World War I, trying to deconflict the requirements of the economy with the wartime effort. He served in that role for President Wilson in World War I. Fulfilled that same role for President Roosevelt in World War II. And there, of course, he worked closely with Marshall during Second World War to create many of the instruments of war. So, relationship between Bernard Baruch and Marshall. Let's move into the living room. Before we start in the living room, I had talked about the house and the restoration and so forth, the saving of this house. I want to show you a little photograph. Here's this house in mid-1990s. This house sat here boarded up. This is actually a cleaned up version of the grounds from what it looked like the first time I saw it when I moved out here in about 1990. So there we are. And of course, there was major renovation efforts that had to be undertaken to save this house. Here's some of that. And so this place was brought back to life during the few years before it was open for public tours on Veterans Day in 2005. So it's kind of a remarkable story of the saving of this house by the foundation that was started by B. Powell Harrison in 1989. Here we are in the living room. One of the things you might notice is here's a morning glory pattern that Katherine picked out when they first moved in. Really nice pattern. You look at it just right from some angles, it looks like it's three-dimensional almost. They were able to save this end of that wallpaper. You'll see the rest of the room is a little lighter. That's authentic reproduction of this original pattern that Katherine picked out when they moved in. I kind of look at this room and the collection of furniture as what I call an eclectic mix, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Katherine always had eyes for bargains. Those balances over the windows she bought at a local house sale. The drapes are reproductions. The original were made out of embossed Chinese silk. Some people say some symbols of the Cold War in this room. And this painting over the mantel is probably one of those symbols of the Cold War. So Marshall became Secretary of State in January of 1947. And in just a short time, he went to a very important conference in Moscow, 1947. It was with the foreign ministers of the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France, and the United States, trying to figure out what we're going to do after the war here with Germany, for example. Soviets are pressing for reparations. How about economic unity, political unity, all of those questions. They can't agree on anything. It's a very contentious conference. It goes on for weeks. At the end of that conference, Foreign Minister Molotov of the Soviet Union presents a painting to Marshall on behalf of the Soviet Union. It's by a Russian painter named Bakshaov. It's one of the four seasons. This is a summer scene called Evening. And of course, since it's up around St. Petersburg, where it stays daylight almost 24 hours a day, so you see nobody moving around during some parts of the year. So this was a gift from the Soviet Union. This is actually a painted reproduction. The original's in step-granddaughter's home in Baltimore. Of course, Marshall said Molotov was one of the most difficult people he ever tried to deal with in his life, but very gracious in his thank you note for the painting. So this is one side of the Cold War, perhaps. This painting here is another symbol of the Cold War. It's 1953. President Eisenhower asked Marshall if he would head up the U.S. delegation to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. And of course, Katherine went with him. While they were in the UK, they visited Mr. Churchill at his Chartwell home. Of course, he's an amateur painter. He shows them this painting, which he'd done, the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, in the early 1950s, makes it a gift to him and then ships it to him following a return from the United Kingdom. Of course, this is a digital reproduction. The original was sold at Sotheby's auction by one of the step-grandchildren for $1.2 million several years ago. So two sides of the Cold War here represented in this room. I don't know if you've ever been to VMI. They have what they call the block, where the students sleep, study, eat, all of that, with a big parade field there right in the center of the complex. But he'd have to oftentimes walk to the practice field because he was on the football team. Oftentimes, as he was doing that, he would hear some beautiful piano music coming out of a little house there by the block. And, of course, his mother had played the piano when he was a young boy. He liked good piano music. So what do you think a young boy does? Oh, he just stopped and listened a while. Did that repeatedly. One day he was out there, and the lady of the house came out and said, "Would you like to come in and meet the pianist?" And he did. And it was Lily. She was a beautiful young lady. She had a great personality. Had a heart condition, could never have children. And he said, "I was smitten." In a few weeks, we became steadies. And then they were engaged to be married during his last year plus at VMI. He's graduating summer 1901. Top cadet in his class. Made two big decisions by then. He wants to be an Army officer. He wants to get married. Can't do either. What's the problem? Can't become an Army officer. They don't have enough commissions go around. The Army's too small. Only for West Point, U.S. Military Academy graduates, not for VMI graduates. Oh, but there's going to be More commissions in 1902, the next year. What's going on? Well, the Philippine insurrection has started. The Army is going to have to expand, commencing in January. Maybe I can get one of those commissions. Well, perhaps, but you got to be on a selection list to even be able to take the exam. How do you get on the selection list? Don't know. Wants to get married. Can't get married. Why? Got to have a steady job to support a wife. You don't have a steady job. Can't get married. What's a young boy to do? He takes a job at Danville Military Institute, a high school during the fall of 1901 while he tries to figure all this out. Of course, his father's been involved in Democratic politics up in Pennsylvania. And he tells all of his friends, write a letter of recommendation for George to be selected to take the exam to become a second lieutenant in the Army, and sends George down to Washington to pick him up. Of course, George comes down, he visits, picks up the letters, thanks them for their support, and has a little time on his hands and said, maybe I ought to go to the White House. You can't go to the White House. You can't just walk in there. You got to have appointments. He didn't have an appointment. He goes to the White House. He goes to the visitor office where people do have appointments or waiting for their time. And he just sits down and watches. And what he sees is a couple of elderly gentlemen running the show there. And when people's name is called or appointment time comes up, they get up, they go someplace. In about 15 minutes, they come back and leave. So he just sits up there until the last group of the day gets up to go in. He gets up to go in with them. And of course, he said, the elderly gentleman gave me the eye, but I stood my ground. Well, he walks in with this family from the Midwest. They just want to meet the president, shake his hand. They do, they leave, and it's George and the president. And it's President McKinley, a Republican, shortly before his assassination. And George says, the president was very nice, asked me what I wanted. And we don't know what George said, but he said, I made my case. And for whatever reason, a few weeks later, out comes this list. His name is on it. He takes the exam. He passes with flying colors. He's got a commission. He's got a steady job. He and Lily get married. And a couple of days later, he's got a report for active duty service in the Army at Fort Myer. And of course, they send him to the Philippines without his wife for the next 18 months, but almost didn't get in the Army. Quite a remarkable story, and so I'm glad he did. So that was Lily. And of course, 1924, he's assigned to China. Lily goes with him for 3 years. While they're there, they buy these Chinese chests and stands on the left, and the Chinese chest and stands on the right, and we think the screen in the corner also. In those days, you could buy really nice pieces, have them sent back to the U.S., at a small cost. That was affordable. While we're looking over in this direction, the painting over the chest was a birthday gift now to Katherine, his second wife, when she's in China in 1946 with George, trying to bring the two sides together. That's a birthday gift from the Chiang Kai-sheks in October of 1946. The painting on the left is a watercolor done by Madame Chiang herself, who was quite an accomplished artist. And of course, she had an American background also. Her father attended Vanderbilt University. He was a Methodist minister and businessman. He had a theology certificate from Vanderbilt. Madame Chiang came to this country at about age 8 to 10. Her older sister went to Wesleyan College for Women in Macon, Georgia. And of course, Madame Chiang started Wesleyan for Women, and then she transferred to Wellesley, an Ivy League school. Top scholar there in her senior year, went back to China, studied, met Chiang, became his private secretary, married him, and then I kind of describe her as his window to the outside world. A beautiful and smart lady. And of course, she was the first Chinese national, only the second woman to ever address a joint session of the U.S. Congress, which she did in 1943. And of course, when Katherine accompanied George in China in 1946, Katherine and Madame Jane became friends. And as mentioned, she visited here on more than one occasion, so quite a lady in her lifetime. After Chang died in 1975, she moved back to Laytonton, New York, and lived there until she died in 2003 at about the age of 105. So, one of the top 10 admired women in this country in 1960s. Quite a beautiful and smart lady. And, of course, you've seen her fingerprints all over the house here. Quite a lady. Could you tell me who this gentleman is here?
I've done enough tours, so yes, but I think it's best if you say who he is.
General John J. Blackjack Pershing. Of course, we know him because he was the commander of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. Of course, the U.S. decided to get involved in that war in 1917 on the side of the Allies, the British and French. Of course, they're fighting with big formations like divisions, 20,000 plus soldiers in a division. I don't know if you know how many divisions U.S. Army had when the U.S. decided we're going to get involved. They got zero divisions. So we're going to form that first division. And so they tell all these small units, Army units scattered around the country, are going to be part of this new division. It's going to be the 1st Expeditionary Division. Get yourself up to Hoboken Flats, New Jersey, and New York Harbor to get on ships to go to France and fight. 36 hours before that first shipload loads up, Captain Marshall gets notified, you're going to be the G3 of this new division. You're in charge of plans, operations, and training. He gets himself to New York Harbor. He's on the first ship to France. Second man off when they get there in late June 1917. Division's been renamed now. It's going to be the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one as we know it today.
So he went from captain to general 3-star.
During World War I, he goes from captain to colonel.
Colonel, okay.
Yeah, and becomes a 5-star before it's all over.
Yeah.
But that's during World War II. Okay. Yeah, so it takes actually months to get all of the ships back and forth across the Atlantic to get the entire division there. They start training. Marshall gets a little temporary promotion to major, temporary major. Moves up to be acting chief of staff of the division. His division commander gets called away for other duties. And during that period, General Pershing announces he's going to be down there in the 1st Division's area in early October. He wants to see a demonstration on trench warfare. And no guidance from anybody. Marshall plans this demonstration. And General Pershing arrives there that early October morning with his staff. He's a little hacked off because the division commander's not there to meet him. But here comes the division commander arriving after Pershing, not even aware Pershing's coming or there's going to be anything taking place for him. And they have the demonstration, and Pershing is not pleased. And of course, Marshall says, it's not right, it's not the general's fault. Pershing starts dressing down the division commander right in front of all the officers and soldiers that are assembled there. And so it's not right, it's not the general's fault. I'm the one that planned this operation. So he goes up to General Pershing to try to explain. And of course, Pershing just turned to walk away. And Marshall put his hand on the general's arm to make him stay and face him. I told you about the transcripts, right? I want to play for you a little snippet of the transcripts. This is Marshall talking about that morning when he was interviewed by Dr. Pogue in 1956.
And I put my hand on his arm and practically forced him to talk. And he stopped and he said, what do you got to say? I said, we've had a very hard time. We worked very, very hard. The men have had full advantages of any kind, and they don't expect any. But I said they ought to get a fair deal at any rate. And I just was mad all over, and I thought I'd got me up in the neck. I might as well not try to float, but to splice a little bit. And I forgotten all I said, but I had a rather inspired moment. And the others were horrified, and the General Pershing walked away from me by saying, well, you must appreciate the troubles we have. And I said, yes, again, General. But we have them every day, many a day, and we have to solve every one of them by night.
Well, Marshall had his say, of course, and his friends were watching all this and said, George's military career is over. Well, it wasn't over. Pershing enlisted. Here's this young, red-headed captain, acting temporary major, who would tell him probably what he needed to hear, not what he wanted to hear. So he always made a point to come back and talk to this young officer, Marshall, whenever he visited the 1st Division. So, make a long story short, 1st Division kept training, and they got thrown into battle the following spring at a place called Cotigny. They went on the attack against the Germans. They acquitted themselves very well. They got pulled out of the line. The same day, Marshall gets reassignment orders. Pershing's headquarters, a G3 section. He travels all day into the night. He gets there, and the G3 of a Fox-Connor tells Marshall that, look, we've got more divisions that have been arriving in France. We're going to go on the attack against the Germans with a group of American forces with some French help at a place called Saint-Mihiel. Here are those American forces, and your job, Marshall, you plan that operation. And of course he does that and goes through it about 4 times as the forces keep changing on him. And then they're all set to go on the attack at Saint-Mihiel. And about 2 days before that happens, the Army has, of course, been forming some major headquarters. 1st Army and 2nd Army is forming. And he gets called in and says, by the Chief of Staff of 1st Army, and says, look, there's going to be a larger attack. It's going to be part of an Allied operation that's going to take place about 3 weeks from now, about 70 kilometers from here. And here are the American units that are going to be in that battle, and here's the starting location for each. So we got the Americans on the right, we got the French on their left, the British and Belgians on up the line. Your job, Marshall, you get them all moved and then placed at the right time with their right supplies and all of that to commence this big battle. He dashes back to his office and realizes that his job is to move more than 500,000 troops, American troops, and he's got like 2 weeks to get it done. He's only got 3 rudimentary roads to move them through. Oh, by the way, part of the French army has got to go through that same area at the same time to get their positions on the Americans' left flank. And oh, by the way, for the Americans, their movements all got to be done at night, some at foot speed, some at horse speed, some at truck speed. So he became known as a brilliant logistical planner for the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, the big battle of World War I. So that takes place. They go on the attack at Saint-Mihiel. They acquit themselves very well. They hold, they start moving. And of course, the big battle unfolds. You have the Meuse River up here with the Germans with their back to the river. And you have the Americans with 2nd Army on the right and 1st Army on the left. And the battle starts to unfold. And things go pretty well for the first few weeks. And then things start bogging down. It's raining, it's cold, it's wet, everything's stuck. Troops are sleeping in the open, morale is plummeting. And of course, General Pershing had lost his wife and a couple of his children in a fire in their quarters in the Presidio of San Francisco a couple of years earlier. And they're hearing General Pershing scream out his wife's name at night, his kid's name at night. He's feeling the pressure. And they're really worried maybe General Pershing is cracking up. But General Pershing made 2 big decisions then. The first one, we're going to hold with 2nd Army on the right. We're going to make a big push with 1st Army. Second big decision, Colonel Marshall now, who's gone from captain to colonel in a bit more than a year. You're now G3 of 1st Army. Bring me the plans. Let's get going. They go back on the attack and, of course, bring the war to an end when the Germans sue for peace just a couple of weeks later. So Marshall played a fairly important role in World War I. And of course, General Pershing, a very smart guy, great officer, became Chief of Staff of the Army after World War I. I would give you one guess as to who Pershing picked to be his military assistant and aide after the war for the next 5 years.
Ulysses S. Grant.
Marshall, of course. And of course, Pershing was best man at Marshall's wedding to his second wife, Katherine. And of course, he considered himself to be the mentor for Marshall for the rest of Pershing's life. And so I say they're two primary architects of the modern U.S. Army, and that would be Pershing and Marshall. And that was quite a relationship that got started on that rocky October day in 1917. As you look around the room here, you will see other photographs of individuals. The one on the table there, I have a bigger version of here. And that is out on the front porch. And what you'll see there is President Truman. You'll see daughter Margaret here. You see a couple of family friends. And you will see George, and you'll see Katherine, and here is Tupper. That's Alan's son. We saw Alan's portrait back in the north hallway. But it's again the Trumans gathering here and visiting with the Marshalls. A couple of photographs of King Albert and Queen Elizabeth of Belgium in the World War I era. We know that there was some interface with Marshall and the staffs, at least of the King and Queen. During the victory tour, when Marshall accompanied General Pershing on a victory tour around Europe following World War I. This is Sir John Dill, a British officer. They set up kind of a combined headquarters operation here in Washington during World War II to coordinate the efforts of the two militaries, United Kingdom and the U.S. And Marshall considered Sir John his counterpart. At great risk to himself, Sir John would show Marshall, oh, here's some correspondence from Mr. Churchill to Roosevelt, vice versa, that Marshall wasn't even privy to. They were both trying to win the war. That's what they were all about. Of course, he died during the war, left a request with his wife that he be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, rather unusual for a foreign officer. And of course, in the video we show here at Dodona, you'll see Marshall's gravestone at Arlington National Cemetery, rather modest little headstone. And of course, Marshall made arrangements to have Sir John buried in Arlington. Of course, there was congressional proclamations commending Sir John for his wartime effort. And if you were to visit Arlington National Cemetery today and visit Sir John's gravesite, here's what you would see. Sir John mounted on horseback, of course, his own little alcove of trees there, and not a great distance from Marshall's gravesite in Arlington, but two really, really important people from World War II, Sir John and Marshall. If you got time for a little story, I want to talk about Marshall. Always remembered the little people that helped him on the pathway of success. One story to illustrate that was, of course, during World War I, they had to set up an officer training school in this little village just to train their officers. And Marshall was there in that little village for several weeks before they got involved in the fighting. And her name was Madame Jewett, and her husband, a little home. Marshall and a couple of other Army officers lived there for a few weeks. And of course, Madame Jewett would wash their clothes, make their beds, prepare their meals, all that, so they could focus on their military duties. He and Madame Jewett became friends. And after World War I, they just stayed in touch over the years. And he said about once a season they'd exchange letters 3 or 4 times a year. But then after Germany invaded France for World War II, he didn't hear from his old friend, Madame Jewett, anymore. Didn't know what had happened to her. So after the Normandy invasion, he's looking at his map one day, and he sees this little village that Madame Jouett lived in. It's in General Patton's area. So he gets a message to General Patton, if you have a chance, would you have someone look in on Madame Jouett, just see if she survived, and pay my respects if she did. And of course, as Marshall said in his interviews later on, I got a full report from Patton a couple of weeks later. And as Marshall tells it, when General Patton got his message, well, General Patton and 5,000 armored troops descended on this little French village. And of course, that causes a big commotion. Here's General Patton with his 2 revolvers, and here comes the mayor and the town leaders out to talk to Patton and find out what's going on. And of course, General Patton confronts him in his lousy French. He just bellows at him, "Where's Madame Jouett?" They don't even know who Madame Jouett is, but General Patton made it very clear she's a very important person. You better look after her, and left a truckload of supplies to tide her over. So, General Patton, anything worth doing is worth overdoing. Marshall always remembered the little people that he dealt with on his pathway to success. So he was a man of character, and that was a part of it. The little people, it's the underdog. It's always remembered. One of the things that I think we're really proud of here at the Marshall House, Dodona Manor, are some of the programs that we've been able to get in place over the years that helps tell the Marshall story, but also adds to Marshall's legacy. One of those is the Ethical Leadership Conference program that was started here a few years ago. So several times during the year, typically rising senior students in high school will come here for an evening with their parents on a Friday evening, and there will be dinner, and there will be a couple of leadership talks, and then on Saturday, the students will spend a full day on case studies of how an ethical leader operates using Marshall as the prototype. So we're trying to do that, and we have a middle school program in the spring of each year when the 7th grade history classes are up to the World War II, beginning of the Cold War era. We will be the guest instructors for a day and help reinforce some of their learning of that period by talking about Marshall, the roles he played in those central events leading through World War II, the Marshall Plan, all of those things, kind of setting the post-war posture for this last 75 years plus after World War II. So we're trying to reach out to young people to the extent we can, and we'll talk to them about leadership principles and practices that Marshall employed during his lifetime, and let them know that, adhering to those things that Marshall stood for is, a good recipe for success in life. And so we're more than just a house. It's the programs that we have in place that are really going to help keep that legacy of Marshall alive, we hope, for the next centuries.
Guess that's pretty much it. Is there anything else that would be good to cover? Or?
Let's go back up to the Houb room for a minute. I want to tell you a story, too.
All right.
So Marshall became Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army on the first day of September 1939, same day that Germany invaded Poland. Of course, that's a 4-year tour, Chief of Staff of the Army. We didn't have an Air Force back then, so he's got the air and the ground, all of that. Thought he was going to retire in 1943 after just 42 years of active duty service. War got in the way. Of course, Katherine's really looking forward to that retirement date. George, where are we going to settle down? Where are we going to enjoy life? He didn't know. Never owned his own home. It's wherever the Army sent him, that's where he was. He was born in Pennsylvania, Uniontown. His father's involved in the coke and coal business, supporting steel mills around Pittsburgh. Some Virginia connections. His father bought a lot of land over in Shenandoah Valley around Luray. Lost it all in a land bust when George was a little boy. Of course, George went to school in Virginia. His brother Stuart also went to VMI. And John Marshall, Chief Justice, Supreme Court, a distant relative. So some Virginia connections. So, make a long story short, about a year after he's been chief of staff, his wife Katherine came out to Leesburg on a fall afternoon, just looking around. She saw a for sale sign out here on Route 7, Market Street. Colonial home, inquire within, 4 acres. She came in, she looked around, got a nice big house, she got a garage, she got a tool shed. She kind of liked the place. Gave her $10 earnest money as down payment. And the story goes, picked a for sale sign up and tossed it in the bushes on the way out to discourage the competition. Well, they closed on this property in spring of 1941 for $16,000. That was to be their weekend getaway place during the war years. And of course, it took about a year for George to get out here. He's too busy with the war effort. Of course, Katherine did everything she could to get the place spruced up and really shining and sparkling. So when he saw it for the first time, he's going to like it. Of course, when he finally did get out here, he did walk around, he looked, and then he finally said, "This is home." And so it did become their home. And then, after the war, he retires. And then they did get to move in here. And in 1959, George dies. And Katherine says she couldn't bear to live here anymore. The memories were too powerful. She moved to North Carolina. Katherine deeded this place to her daughter Molly and son-in-law James Wynn. And the Wynns lived here with their children until the kids grow up, go away. They grew old, went into nursing homes. The house sat here vacant for years, all boarded up, plywood windows. And then that's when B. Powell Harrison in 1989 learned that this place was about to be turned into a shopping center. So he started the foundation to try to raise the money to buy this property from the family and save it as a legacy to Marshall. Of course, B. Powell was a VMI graduate, lifelong Leesburg resident, preservationist, started the Piedmont Environmental Council trying to protect the countryside in this part of Virginia, Army officer in World War II. And of course, he attended St. James Episcopal Church, same place the Marshalls attended. So it was a major effort to raise that money to buy the property, and it took 6 years to raise the $2.3 million to buy this property from the family, and then several more years to raise the additional $5 million plus needed to restore and to renovate this place. Chief of Staff of the Army for just 10 relationship. Yeah, fortunately, in my lifetime, I was in the Army for 30 years. I worked for the Chief of Staff of the Army in the last 3.5 years, and I happened to be for wartime, part of that. And I don't know if you know what Chief of Staff of the Army does. He raises the Army, organizes it, trains it, equips it, houses it, clothes it, feeds it, supplies it. Oh, by the way, the strategy to employ it back then, the tactics and techniques, all of that, dealing with allies, dealing with the President of Congress all the time. It's a big job. And of course, said before the Normandy invasion, he's increased that army from 175,000 to over 8 million, quite a feat. Chief of Staff of the Army is a lonely place during wartime. You got an individual with great responsibility. You got things coming at you in every direction. Who do you confide in? Who do you listen to? For George, it was Katherine. She was his confidant. Great admiration and respect they had for each other. This painting behind me here is a picture of George and Katherine superimposed on the house here at Dodona Manor. You'll see this on the cover of Katherine's book. That painting, to me, shows the great admiration and respect those two extraordinary people had for each other. Katherine and her first husband had a cottage up on Fire Island off of Long Island, New York, which was a kind of a summer vacation place that they would go to. And so I want to tell you a little story involved in Fire Island and illustrating that relationship between George and Katherine. So after he and Katherine had been married a few years, in 1939, just a few weeks before Marshall became Chief of Staff of the Army, they're up there on a weekend. And the kids are there, and they're flying kites along the beach on a Saturday morning. And they're watching the kites, and Katherine starts laughing. And George says, "What are you laughing at, the kites?" And she said, "No, I'm laughing at the kite's tails. I feel just like one of those kite tails, an army wife, just following you around wherever you go." And George says, "Oh, Katherine, you got to remember, kite's tail is the most important part of the kite. If that kite's tail's too heavy, the kite just falls to the ground. If that kite's tail's too light, it just goes aimlessly around the sky. But only if that kite's tail is perfectly balanced can that kite soar." And of course, they did soar and soar together for the next 12 years of his public life. And so that's a little story that Katherine tells in her book, which was published in 1946. But it kind of illustrates to me that special relationship between George and Katherine, who were both extraordinary people. One of my favorite stories of Marshall and the principles and practices that he had is always picking the right guy for the job. So a good illustration of that is, I think, this relationship between Eisenhower and Marshall. Pearl Harbor, December 1941. Before that, Marshall and Eisenhower had barely even met. But Marshall knew who Eisenhower was. And of course, Eisenhower just got picked up for Brigadier General on the list just a few weeks before that. So that following week, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Eisenhower's just been selected for Brigadier. He's down at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. He gets a call from Marshall's office. Beadle Smith tells Eisenhower, "Get yourself up to Washington fast you can. Marshall needs you. War plans." So, of course, the last thing Eisenhower wants to do is to get in a staff job here if we're going to be war and so forth. But he packs a suitcase. He gets a flight to Dallas. Tries to fly to Washington, but Kane has to take a train. And so he takes a train, arrives here on Sunday morning, 1 week after Pearl Harbor. Of course, his brother Milton picks him up over at Union Station. "Come on over to the house and have breakfast." And of course, Ike says, I don't have time. I got to get to the War Department. Marshall will be waiting. Of course, he goes in. There's Marshall at work already on that Sunday morning, and Eisenhower reports in. And of course, Marshall mentions no words of greetings or any of that. Says, we're in dire straits in the Pacific. We've got a big part of the fleet laying on the bottom of the ocean. We only got 2 carriers left. We got to protect the west coast of the United States. We got to protect Hawaii. And he says, "I need your thoughts on where do we draw the line? How do we take on the Japanese in the Pacific? What do we do about the Philippines? I'm not sure we could even mount a rescue effort for the Philippines and get through the Japanese defenses. So what's your ideas?" Of course, Eisenhower said, "Well, you got to give me a little time." And so he goes off to finds an empty desk in war plans. And he's back in a few hours with his typewritten notes and ready to talk to Marshall. And he tells Marshall what he thinks, how they should proceed. And he says, as far as the Philippines, you know, it's one thing if we try to save the Philippines and fail. It's another thing if we don't try at all. If we don't try, the Filipino people are never going to forgive us. So at least we got to try. And of course, Marshall said, "Okay, yeah, you're reassigned to war plans. You're down the Far East in the Philippine division." And, you know, Eisenhower's ready to go. And Marshall says, "Before you go, you know, I got lots of folks here who can do the analysis, tell me what they think I need to do. They bring every decision to me. And of course, he says, Eisenhower, I need guys that I can have do the analysis and then take the action that's needed when it's needed and tell me after the fact what you've done. Well, Eisenhower got the message. And of course, Eisenhower said, it's just like I've been tested. It's like Marshall already knew the answers. He's kind of agreeing with what I laid out to him. And of course, Eisenhower was right, because the same time they're talking that afternoon, Secretary of War Stimson is over briefing the president on the strategy that he and Marshall have already agreed on. And Roosevelt's called in the Navy and telling them to support it. So, yeah, that was the start of that relationship between Eisenhower and Marshall that resulted in the greatest American victory since the Revolutionary War. So, two extraordinary people, but Marshall always picked the right guy for the right job. And that was a special relationship. I'll tell you one I tell to young students that come through here. Okay? Marshall was not a good student in grade school and high school. But then he found himself in the Army, and he's only been in the Army for 5 years. And he decides he wants to go to the Infantry Cavalry School at Fort Leavenworth. Fort Leavenworth is kind of the center of, Army education, the most advanced in the Army. They have 2 courses there at Fort Leavenworth. They have the first-year course. It'll be about 100 students. And then they have the Staff College course for the second year. And the top 24 out of the 100 that come for the first year gets invited to stay for the second year. Of course, Marshall really wants to stay for the second year because he wants to go to the War College eventually, and the only way he can get to War College is having completed the Staff College. So he wants to do that bad. And, of course, he starts the first year there. He's not prepared, really. I mean, it's a tough course. He's had nobody helping him. He's an infantry officer. And, he's trying his best he can. And he overhears some of his classmates one day talking about who they think's going to be invited to stay for the second year. He didn't hear his name. I did it. He bore down and studied harder than he'd ever studied in his life. Top man in his class for that first year, invited to stay for the second year. He bore down again that second year. Top man in his class. Invited to stay on the faculty then for the next 2 years. Youngest faculty member there at Fort Leavenworth. So what he learned was, you can do it if you try. You can really do better than you think you can. And so he bore down the hardest in his life. And of course, after that, he knew the importance of education. So he was a big advocate of, every officer should be an instructor for a tour, because you learn more as an instructor than you're ever going to learn as a student. And, as a student, if you really bear down, you can become a good student. And so, I think that's a message for young people. And I think most young people in school today, I certainly would agree with that. Looking back in my past, I could have done better if I'd really applied myself as best I could.
Marshall wasn't competing against the other kids. He was competing against himself.
He was competing to achieve a goal that he really wanted to achieve. And completing that first year course, being in the top 24, being able to qualify for that second year course, really motivated him and made him do his best to achieve that. Whereas in grade school and high school and at VMI, it was not that great motivation that he found later in life. So it's a message for all of us. If you really want to do it, you can do almost anything you set your mind to. Yeah, I'll tell you another story. One of the really tough challenges for Marshall in World War II was picking the key leaders. I'm talking about the leaders for armies, groups, corps, divisions. It wasn't just the people, well, he wanted to have trust, but who are those people that can be the leaders, who knows and is smart enough and has the right attitude, the character to stand up, do the right thing, got the smarts to win in battles, have the character to take advantage of situations that develop. And so what he found himself at the beginning of World War II, and they did the Louisiana maneuvers, which he'd overseen. That was his idea, where you had non-shooting but blue on red forces in Louisiana, Arkansas, East Texas, that area of the country. And he really found out, which of those potential commanders were really up to it, who were too old, not physically fit anymore, time had passed them by. So there were really some tough choices. And one day he found himself in his office with the entire delegation from a large state in his office, the congressman and the senators, and it had to do with the commander of this National Guard division. And Marshall has decided, this guy's not competent anymore. I've got to replace him. And, of course, all of these congressional people there are arguing the other side. You can't fire him. He's a great guy. It was great. Look what he did in World War I, and so forth. And Marshall is, telling them why this individual needs to be replaced. And finally, Marshall says, you folks seem to be only representing one of your constituents. That's this division commander. That's the only guy you're worried about. I'm worried about those tens of thousands of other soldiers that are going to be under this leader. I got to think about them. I got to think about how we're going to have the best commander to lead this force, how we can minimize casualties and also succeed at the same time. I need somebody qualified. I'm worried about those tens of thousands of your other constituents. Well, that kind of sends them reeling. And as they're trying to recover from that, he says, I'll just put it to you this way. If I stay, he goes. If he stays, I go. And so, the Chief of Staff of the Army is about to resign over this. And of course, they all leave disgruntled and so forth. And the next day, one of those senators comes back to Marshall's office, and he tells Marshall, I was talking to my wife last night. I told her about our meeting yesterday and what happened. And she reminded me that one of those constituents you claim for your own is probably our son. Mm-hmm. He's in the Army now. And she said, I'm glad our son's in the Army. And I'm glad Marshall's at its top. So, he thought about it and so, Marshall's right. And so those were difficult choices because many times it was old friends that you'd served with before, but who were just not up to this task of this war that's about to unfold. And you've got to choose the best people you have to provide those leadership and fill those positions. It's not only, the employment, but how do you minimize casualties and how do you have the smarts and the stamina and the mental quickness and all of that to provide the leadership that's needed. And so tough choices, particularly when it involves friendship. But that's what he had to deal with. There's two stories here. There's the story of saving this house, which is a story unto itself almost. And then there's the story of Marshall and, this house, and provides a setting to talk about many of the things he did during the war. Marshall would put people to work. I'll tell you another story or two. Of course, he's out here on weekends when he can, and it's kind of hard to get help out here, and there's a lot to do. You got to keep the maintenance of the house up. It's during World War II, and occasionally some of his friends from Fort Myer would come out. Hap Arnold was head of the Army Air Corps, General Arnold. And so General Arnold said, I'll come out and give you a hand this weekend. And, of course, George said, okay, great, bring your work clothes. And so George is out here working on one of the windows and so forth, and General Arnold drives up in his sedan. He's got his white uniform on, and Marshall said, "Oh, I hope you brought your work clothes." "Oh, yeah, I'll go up and change," and he does. Of course, Katherine has been thinking before General Arnold comes, and she tells George, "Yeah, I think maybe we'll have General Arnold trim the roses over in the rose garden. Not too strenuous." And so General Arnold changes his clothes. He comes back downstairs, and he's changed, but he's still got white stuff on. And so Marshall tells him what to do and so forth. And of course, Katherine looks out of her window a little later, expecting to see General Arnold over in the rose garden. She doesn't see him. She comes down to George and says, "Oh, where's General Arnold? I thought he was going to be in the rose garden." "Well, I put him out where he can get a workout." She goes looking for him. Of course, she get him out here in the old compost pile out by the fence there with all this compost and so forth. And she goes over there, and of course, there's General Arnold. He's got this pitchfork. He's turning all this stuff upside down. He's got it all over his white clothing. And she said, "Oh, come out of there, General Arnold." He said, "No, I'm going to finish this." "Man, what's George got in here? Heaviest stuff I've ever seen." So when you come out to visit George to put to work, he puts you to work. So that's a good example. Yeah. And of course, his garden, his vegetable garden, was therapy for George. Get his mind off of whatever he's been focusing on, concentrating on the war effort for a little while, for a few hours. And there's one story about, Beadle Smith came out. Of course, he was chief of staff for Eisenhower after the Normandy invasion, and of course become director of the CIA. But one afternoon, Beadle Smith comes to pay a little business call on Marshall, and Marshall's out here working in his garden, and it's a light rain, misting, and Marshall's down there picking vegetables, and Beadle Smith's trying to conduct business with him, and it's raining, and he says, "General, do I have to stand out here in the rain just to talk to you?" And Marshall reaches over and picks up a 5-gallon bucket and turns it upside down and says, "No, Beadle, have a seat." So, Marshall was serious about his gardening and so forth. And, it's just a little inconvenience. It doesn't bother him. I'm ready to do business. Yeah. So there's all kinds.
If you go through 2 world wars, standing out in a little drizzle is not going to annoy you.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a couple of little stories. And one of the things he told in his interviews from his youth, I'll tell you this one, it's the middleman, the role of the middleman. As a young boy, George and his best bud, Andy, went with their mothers to a nursery one day, and they saw all these beautiful plants and realized, hey, you could plant these seeds and end up with beautiful flowers and so forth in a nursery. So he and his bud Andy started their little nursery. And so they grow a few things and so forth. And, they'd always looking for things that they could sell in their nursery. And one day they were out on the countryside with their little wagon, and they found some beautiful forget-me-nots out here on the hillside in spring. They dig up a bunch of those and take them back to the nursery and so forth. And then they go to school this next week, and they take these. They have these forget-me-nots, and so they took them. They dug them up. They find these strawberry containers, these boxes, and they paint them green with a little purple color around the top. And they put those forget-me-nots in there, put a little moss in there. They're really beautiful. So they go to school, and they run home for recess, and they bring some back and sell them to the girls. Oh, they're beautiful. They like them. They pay money for them. And then, like a couple of weeks later, they go out on their spring picnic in the countryside. And guess what? All the girls see these forget-me-nots out on here in the hillside, and they realize that George and Andy have just sold them. They got them for free, and then they sold them to them. And, of course, they boycotted them and put them out of business at their greenhouse. But, Marshall said, it's a role of the middleman. Here we are. We go out and find these plants. We dig them. We transport them back to the nursery. We do prepare all the containers. We do all of that. We transport them to school. And, they put us out of business because they think we had nothing invested in these things. It's the middleman. The role of the middleman plays a really important role. So, and that's something he knew throughout his career. That those middlemen are really important.